To anyone looking in, Claire Renard had a beautiful life. A white-painted house with hydrangeas blooming out front. 2 children who called her Mama, with softness in their voices. A husband, Jonathan, who wore clean suits to church and shook the pastor's hand with confidence. They sat in the second pew every Sunday, always together, always smiling. She wore her hair pinned, her dresses modest, her jewelry simple. Her voice was gentle, her manners flawless. To her friends in the church circle, Claire was what you prayed your daughter would grow into. But that's the trouble with surface things. You forget how much rot can live underneath. Jonathan wasn't cruel. He never raised his voice, never struck her. He said grace at dinner and paid the bills on time. He bought her flowers twice a year, Valentine's and her birthday, and kissed her forehead every morning. But somewhere between year 2 and year 10, he stopped seeing her. Conversations became calendar checks. Intimacy became a schedule. Affection became duty. He loved her, perhaps, but distantly, like someone protecting a relic, not a living soul. And Claire, in her silence, began to unravel in ways no one could see. Not even herself. It wasn't depression, not exactly. It was a slow fading, like color leaching out of fabric left too long in the sun. She still woke early, still made the children's lunches, still attended her women's Bible study. But inside, she was shrinking. At night, she stared at the ceiling while Jonathan slept soundly beside her. Sometimes she would whisper prayers, not to ask for things, but just to be heard, just to know someone, somewhere, still noticed her. She didn't want escape. She wanted to matter. In the eyes of someone who wasn't checking the clock. There was a moment, small and stupid, but she remembered it. It seemed to crystallize the ache. She had come home with a new haircut, shorter, lighter. The stylist had said it framed her cheekbones. She felt brave. Jonathan didn't notice. Not that day. Not the next. 3 days later, he said, "Something's different." Then went back to reading the news. That night, Claire cried in the shower for reasons she couldn't explain. She was tired of being invisible in her own home. Tired of pretending the warmth she craved was sinful. And that's when she started going to confession again. Not because she'd sinned, but because she needed to hear her name said out loud. She stepped into the booth the following Wednesday, the wood creaking beneath her weight, the scent of wax and ash clinging to the curtain. Her voice barely made it through the screen. "Bless me, Father. I think I'm disappearing." And from the other side, a voice answered, low, gentle, certain. "Then let me see you." She didn't know his name yet, but she knew something had just shifted. Not like thunder, more like a breeze finding a crack in the window and letting itself in. His name was Father Lucien Devereux, and he did not enter the town of Bellemere like a firebrand or a prophet. He came quietly, arriving one pale December morning when the trees were bare and the church roof wore a thin coat of frost. No grand announcement, no bold sermon, just a soft-voiced introduction, a faint smile, and the sort of presence that made people lower their voices without knowing why. He wasn't old, 40 maybe, but carried himself like someone who had lived twice as long. There was gravity in his stillness, something worn and deeply familiar in his eyes, as if he knew sorrow, but refused to bow to it. His first homily was short, barely 12 minutes. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't quote fire and brimstone. He spoke about winter, not the season outside, but the one people carry inside, the kind that comes after loss, after disappointment, after too many days waking up next to someone who no longer sees you. Claire sat in the second pew, and didn't move once. She went home that day and cried, not because she understood why, but because something inside her had been touched. 3 days later, she returned to the church, alone, midweek. The place was nearly empty, hollow in the way only sacred spaces are when stripped of ceremony. She walked into the confessional and closed the curtain behind her. It had been months, years maybe. "Bless me, Father," she whispered. "I'm not sure what I've done." The other side of the screen stayed quiet for a long moment. Then, "You don't have to confess a crime to be hurting." She inhaled sharply. His voice was calm, measured, but warm, like heat rising through old stone. She didn't mean to say much, but something about the way he listened, without judgment, without interruption, drew words from her like water from a cracked wall. She told him about the distance in her marriage, about how she prayed and never felt heard, about how sometimes she smiled at her children and felt like she was lying. She expected advice. She got silence. And somehow, that was exactly what she needed. "Come back," he said softly. "Not because you're broken, but because you've been too quiet for too long." She returned the next week. Then, the next. It became a rhythm, a meeting place. Not just in the booth, but in her spirit. She didn't know what to call it. Friendship? Confession? Something else entirely? He never asked personal questions, never said anything inappropriate. And yet, something passed between them each time. A current. A pause too long. A phrase too carefully chosen. One Wednesday, after she had finished speaking, she stayed seated in the booth long after he had offered the words of absolution. "Do you ever get lonely, Father?" she asked. There was a pause, longer than usual. "Yes," he said, and that was all. But it was enough. The next Sunday, Claire found herself glancing up mid-hymn to where he stood on the altar. He wasn't looking at her, not directly, but she felt seen anyway. Not as a sinner, not as a wife, as a woman who had dared to be honest with someone, and hadn't been punished for it. It frightened her, how much she looked forward to Wednesdays now. Not for God, not for forgiveness, but for a voice that called her Claire, in a way her husband never had. It was Lent when it happened. The nights had grown longer, and the air held that sharp, aching chill that made everything feel closer to death than resurrection. The church, too, had dimmed for the season. No flowers, no music, just stone, silence, and the sound of breath between prayers. Claire had stayed late after the Stations of the Cross. Everyone else had filed out, their footsteps echoing against marble. She remained in the shadows near the statue of Mary, watching the candlelight dance across the folds of the Virgin's robe. The chapel was cold, still, holy in a way that felt heavier than usual. She didn't mean to wait for him, but she did. Lucien appeared without sound, as he always did. A dark coat over his cassock, a book in his hand. When he saw her, he hesitated. Not startled, but aware. She turned to him slowly. "I didn't want to go home," she said. He didn't ask why, didn't need to. He offered tea in the rectory. She followed. No one saw. The rectory was quiet, lit only by one small lamp and the pale blue spill of moonlight from the kitchen window. The tea steamed between them on the table, untouched. They sat across from each other, and for a time said nothing. And then she asked, "Do you think God punishes us for needing more than what we have?" Lucien's jaw tensed. His gaze dropped to the table. "No," he said softly. "I think God weeps when we stop admitting it." She breathed out slowly, like someone lowering a weight. "I feel like I'm dying quietly," she whispered. He looked at her then. Not as a priest, not as a confessor, as a man who knew exactly what that felt like. Something moved between them, not like a storm, but like fog curling under a locked door. She reached across the table. Fingertips, that's all. Just the soft brush of her hand against his. And he didn't pull away. Instead, his fingers turned slowly, so hers could settle in the spaces between. Their palms met, like they'd been searching for each other in the dark for years. No kiss, no rushing, just stillness, a cathedral of breath and skin. Her eyes closed, his did not. He looked at her face in that moment, so open, so fragile, and felt something break in his chest. Not desire, not even love, but something older. The terrifying realization that once a heart knows it's been seen, it cannot pretend again. When she finally let go, he didn't speak. She stood. He walked her to the door. The moon was brighter now, hanging like judgment over the frozen chapel. She turned to him on the step. And for a second, she looked like a woman on the edge of something eternal. "Good night, Father," she said, voice shaking. But her eyes didn't. He whispered back, "Good night, Claire." As she stepped into the cold, her fingers still tingled. And his hand, resting at his side, didn't stop shaking until dawn. It never became an affair in the way people imagine. There were no hotel rooms, no fevered undressing, no tangled sheets and whispered, "I shouldn't," between hurried kisses. What Claire and Lucienne shared unfolded slowly, quietly, like scripture written in invisible ink, only visible to the soul. They never touched again, not in that way, but something had already passed between them, something irreversible, a knowing. And once you are known, the absence of touch becomes more dangerous than the act itself. She kept going to confession. But the words changed. Less penance, more presence. She'd speak of dreams she hadn't told even her diary, of moments with her children that felt like ghosts, of nights in her marriage that echoed like empty rooms. Lucien listened. He always listened. But he also began to speak, softly, carefully, about his father's silence, his decision to enter the priesthood at 23, not out of divine calling but escape, about how some men find the collar not because they are holy, but because they are frightened of who they are without it. Claire didn't flinch. She just breathed deeper. They sat that way often, in the chapel after hours, with only candlelight between them. Not touching, not even speaking sometimes. Just two people, side by side, in the aching purity of what they could never allow. The candles watched. They heard it all. The pauses, the held breaths. The names said too tenderly. One night, Lucien looked at her longer than he should have. She noticed. "What is it?" she asked, barely a whisper. "I'm afraid," he said. "Of what?" He didn't answer, but his eyes did. Of what he was becoming, of how far they had already come, and how much further he still wanted to go. She reached toward him, reflex, not plan, and laid her hand on his arm. It was not erotic. It was not pure. It was the kind of touch you give someone standing at the edge of a cliff. And he closed his eyes, because he knew. This was the last time they could be this version of themselves, half in, half out. Pretending that silence was safety, that restraint was a virtue. And yet, neither of them moved. They stayed like that for almost an hour. Just the sound of the candles crackling, the soft weight of her hand, and the unbearable holiness of want. When she left, she kissed his cheek. Just once. And he let her. Afterward, he sat in the pew where she had been and wept like he hadn't in 20 years. Because it wasn't guilt that undid him. It was the grief of finally feeling loved. in a way that God had never managed. The end came quietly. No slammed doors, no bitter argument, no lightning bolt from heaven. Just a letter, slipped beneath the sacristy door one April morning. Typewritten, unsigned. One sentence. Ask Father Lucien why Claire Miller leaves the rectory after evening prayer. That was all it took. By dusk, the bishop had called. By week's end, Lucien had offered his resignation. No meeting, no confrontation. Just an envelope, a folded cassock, and a voicemail Claire would replay a dozen times before deleting. I did not protect you, or myself. I hope you will forgive me. And then, he was gone, transferred, disappeared, dismantled from the parish website like he had never existed. No scandal was made public. That was the Church's way. They preferred the silence. Let the sin rot in shadows, so long as the altar remained polished. Claire stayed. But she was not untouched. Bellemere was a small town, and small towns have sharp teeth. The women at Bible study grew colder. The glances at the grocery store stretched longer. Mothers pulled their children's hands just a little closer when she passed. No one said anything outright, but the silence around her grew thicker than any accusation. Jonathan moved into the guest room. He didn't ask questions, didn't shout. He just stopped saying her name. Claire filed for divorce in early summer. She packed her things alone. Moved into a small apartment on the edge of town, where the rent was low and the light was better for painting. She took up art again. Not landscapes like before. Now she painted hands. Always reaching. Never touching. Lucien never came back. But 2 months after he left, a package arrived, wrapped in plain brown paper. Inside, a worn leather prayer book, pages dog-eared and annotated in soft pencil. Inside the front cover, a single line written in his familiar hand. Some loves do not lead us to heaven, but they still teach us how to pray. She placed the book on her nightstand and never opened it again. Some nights, she would sit on her balcony and look up at the stars, not to ask why, not even to remember him, but because the sky was the only place big enough to hold everything they'd broken. She never stopped loving him. Not really. Not the way she had loved Jonathan. Safe, expected, dutiful. But the way a fire loves the match that lit it. For what it made her feel, for what it consumed, and for what it could never be again. The town moved on. It always does. Another priest took Lucien's place, polished, smiling, unscarred. The pews filled again. The whispers faded. But every now and then, when the light hit the chapel just right, someone swore they could still smell the ghost of candle smoke lingering beneath the stone. And maybe that's what Claire became too. A ghost with a heartbeat. A woman who once dared to love the man behind the collar, and lost everything that came before it, but gained, at last, the truth. That some confessions are not made in booths. They are made in beds of silence, beneath trembling hands, with the knowledge that even one true moment of being seen can damn you, and still feel like grace.